Bonjour les Français et bienvenue aux Outsiders, le programme le plus anti-woke du monde, contre la correctness politique, contre le communisme, contre le marxisme, contre le socialisme, contre le global warming. Je suis votre hôte, Rondine, et avec moi, comme toujours, c'est mon grand ami et mon collègue journaliste et bon vivant sophistiqué du Daily Telegraph, c'est Monsieur James Morrow.
Ah, monsieur, la vie est trop courte pour boire du vin mauvais. Oh.
Et encore, ce matin, nous avons la belle, la merveilleuse, la géniale, la charmante blogueuse de YouTube, Mademoiselle Daisy Cousin-Cousine.
Bonjour mes amis, mangez bien, riez souvent, aimez beaucoup.
Mais enfin, une catastrophe diplomatique a développé entre la France et l'Australie. C'est la grande consolation des sous-marins français. These are French submarines, 90 billions de dollars. La vache, mais c'était pas notre faute. C'était une idée stupide de ce Malcolm Turnbull et ce Christopher Pyne qui ont demandé remplacer les moteurs nucléaires, avec ces moteurs du diesel, comment dit-on, un lawnmower engine. Enfin, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? Une apologie? Mais non, tant pis, no hard feelings. Alors, comme Edith Piaf en Australie, c'est la vie, we have no regrets. Rien de rien.
Oh, je ne regrette rien, ni le bien qu'on m'a fait, ni le mal, tout ça m'est bien égal.
Et maintenant, les nouvelles des Outsiders. So, James and Daisy, the French ambassador's thrown a tantrum, croissants out the window, headed off to the airport, they cancelled the gala thing in Washington. James, we've upset the French.
We've upset the French, but, can you imagine, was there any luckier guy on the entire continent of Australia than the French ambassador who woke up Friday morning and found out that he was being recalled from Canberra to Paris? I mean, come on, this is something that the rest of us are all dreaming about. But seriously, though, this was the denouement, if you will, of a long misadventure, as you so eloquently put it in the best Pepe Le Pew Francais about Malcolm Turnbull and Christopher Pyne. This was a deal that was never going to work. And the French, they thought, well, we'll go along with it to win the contract, and that's what they did. Other countries said, like the Germans, they said, no, there's no way we can do this thing where we kind of build it here and then finish it in Adelaide. It's not going to work. The French said, sure, whatever you like, we'll do it to sign the deal. But then, of course, obviously it was never going to work out. And so this was always going to get to this point. The fascinating thing to me is just how much deception was played on the French here, because they actually had somebody in Adelaide waiting in a quarantine hotel room, waiting to sign the paperwork for the next segment of the deal when they found out about this. So this was incredibly kept under wraps here. I can understand why the French are annoyed, but, they signed up to a deal that they knew when they signed it with us was never going to be able to be fulfilled.
Well, surely, Daisy, this is the point. I mean, I guess we'll never know unless there's some French whistleblower out there. But the French must have been laughing themselves silly at this idea. We've got these perfectly good nuclear submarines. They go like they're just the job you need if you're going to be crawling around the South China Sea, trying to stay underwater for months on end. You can imagine they thought, what's going to happen with the Australian ones, with the diesel engines in there? Boop, 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 boop. Captain, up periscope, up periscope. What are you looking for? I'm looking for a gas station. There's got to be one around here somewhere. I mean, can you imagine? The French must have thought we were ridiculous. I mean, the big surprise, they've cancelled the deal, Yeah, right. Daisy?
Oh, God, yeah. I mean, it was always a bad deal. I mean, even in 2016, common sense should have told them that it was a bad deal. Of course, that was never going to work. Of course, the technology was outmoded. And I'm very surprised, actually, that Malcolm Turnbull went along with it, since he was just the king of renewable energy. There's nothing renewable about diesel, for God's sake, and it's let alone in a submarine. And look, I agree with James. I can understand why the French are a little bit perturbed here. Obviously, they didn't know anything. My understanding is they actually found out through the media. But for goodness sake, one of the reasons it was kept under wraps is so China didn't get wind of it too early and then kind of start making mischief and thus totally defeating the purpose of this alliance. So look, I'm really pleased that Scott Morrison has had the guts to go ahead with this.
I agree with you. I think this is the best thing Scott Morrison's done, and I think he will win the next election purely on the basis of this. But Daisy makes a good point, James, about China. Just have a listen here to the left have all gone berserk, partly because this puts a clear signal to China from Australia that we're not mucking around and we won't be bullied. But have a listen to Waleed Ali, his take on it.
There's another reading of this, which is that we've just explicitly sided with the declining superpower as opposed to the rising superpower, and in the process ensured that we have substandard submarines for the next 20 years.
I mean, this is just nuts. So Waleed Ali, James, would have us join with China and ignore the States. Is this how it works?
Look, I would love to see what the thinking of the great critic of Islamophobia, Waleed Ali, thinks about China and their treatment of their Uyghur Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang province. But that put aside, the left here is playing such an incredibly parochial game because they're trying to make it seem like Australia went and blew up this relationship with the French, and, shame on Morrison for this and for signing us up with the U.S. But you know what's interesting? The commentary in the U.S. is entirely different. There, the right are seeing this as a disaster for Biden because Biden has gotten the French offside over this deal. So it's a real bipartisan thing here. And it's just, you can see with the left here just how much everything becomes, team red, team blue. Oh, well, Morrison signed a good deal, so let's find the people who are angry about it and take their side. Now, that puts you on the side of the French. Okay, fine, they've got good cheese and wine. But it also puts you on the side of the Chinese. Is that where they really want to be? And the thing that I think, though, is most important about this is, beyond the headline spat for the next week, is that this is Scott Morrison doing something really important and really historic to reorientate Australia's defence posture, much more forward-thinking, thank God, but it can only be part of what needs to be done. We need much better resilience when it comes to fuel security onshore, much more ability to have and make spare parts and maintain our own equipment here. We also should be just doing basic things like hardening our bases in the north of Australia. So all of these things need to be done. This is a great first step, though, and a huge amount of congratulations, I think, to the PM and Peter Dutton and Maurice Payne for this.
Absolutely. Well, one of the biggest furphies has been this line that presumably has come from the kind of supporters of Malcolm Turnbull and Christopher Pyne, that back in 2016 when the deal was signed, we didn't realise, China was so bad. We didn't realise. It was a different world back then. We've heard this nonsense spun. Well, let me just tell you, James, I know the Daily Telegraph, I know writers for The Australian, certainly at the Spectator Australia. This was the cover of the Spectator Australia all the way back in May 2016, when we recognised the deal was a dud. Only 5.5 years before anyone else seemed to notice it. But more importantly, as I said here on Outsiders recently, and I wrote in The Spectator, that if Scott Morrison and the coalition want to win the next election, all they needed to do was to lift the moratorium on nuclear energy. And as I wrote, the pitch is simple. If you really believe in net zero emissions, nuclear power is the only way to get us there, at the same time as keeping us economically strong. And I also pointed out that lifting the moratorium on nuclear power would allow us to lease or buy US nuclear subs off the shelf as a powerful deterrent to China. Well, Scott Morrison's done it the other way around. That's great. They got the nuclear subs first. But now let's get on with nuclear energy and ultimately nuclear weapons. Daisy.
Yeah, look, I am so stoked for this because I really do hope it is a stepping stone to greater use of nuclear energy in Australia. And I know Scott Morrison has explicitly said, no, we're not going to, this isn't a big thing on nuclear energy. We're certainly not going to get nuclear weapons. This is just a one-off thing. Look, it's very easy for him to kind of say that now to kind of appease the nuclear alarmist. And again, I understand why there's reticence about nuclear energy. We all remember what happened with Chernobyl. Of course, people are cautious about it. But in terms of it being renewable energy that is reliable, readily available. We have so much uranium in Australia. We're perfectly set up for it. It really absolutely is the way of the future. So yes, he said, no, we're not going to do it now, but I'm sure at the back of his brain is thinking, wow, well, we've got the nuclear subs. This is just a very nice way to ease into actually getting serious about nuclear energy in Australia.
Well, Andrew Clennell mentioned before, James, the news poll coming out tonight. It'll be interesting to see how the public, I suspect the public will be fully supportive of Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton on this. Peter Dutton, by the way, what a star. I mean, that guy is the real deal. I can't envisage this having happened under Maurice Payne or the other one, what was her name, Linda Reynolds. You know, in fact, they were part of the Turnbull deal. Well done to Peter Dutton. He's the muscle behind this. He has to be. James, would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think Peter Dutton has absolutely played a huge role in this, but what you mentioned the news poll before. We've already seen Roy Morgan polling coming out, flash polling on the poll. This is the other interesting political thing about this. Australians are broadly very supportive of this deal, and including half of Labor. So, you know, Scott Morrison did a very smart thing in engineering the terms of the deal in such a way that it really wouldn't set up that fight about nuclear just yet. That fight can come, right, and it will come. So now
Before
it just essentially challenges Labor now to come in behind this deal, which is very reasonable, which they don't have any grounds really to object to. Half of Labor voters think this was a great idea too. So this really puts Albanese in a very tough position, because how do you differentiate yourself against this? And, you know, his job wasn't helped this week by a certain former Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who came out and actually said, you know, in the whole history of conflict, when has a Navy ever beaten the land army? Land armies are what we need. You know, I'm sorry, but Britain ran the whole world off the British Navy for centuries. You know, we could talk about a million different battles, Crimea, God knows what else. You know, so this is what Albo has to contend with here, is just this sort of impression that they're just not serious about this. But I also think one final point, you know, for months, if not years on this show, we have been saying to Scott Morrison, throw some red meat to your base. This is an absolute giant tomahawk steak of red meat for that base, and it comes armed even better with Tomahawk missiles.
And only you would know how to cook that steak, James. I know that from experience.
Minister for Food.
Now, and another bit of red meat was, of course, the Lorraine Finlay appointment, which we'll talk about later in the show. Lots more coming up, but I wanted to touch on euthanasia. We had Queensland euthanasia bill passed. There was a terrific article by Noel Pearson. A great mind, a great thinker. I don't always agree with him, but he made a couple of really good points about the euthanasia bill. Three of them I'll quickly run through. Firstly, that Conservatives are shown once again unable to uphold conservatism on social questions. They are incapable of explaining the importance and relevance of their philosophy to the rest of society. I thought that was a great point. He also talked about how the Queensland MPs talking about euthanasia, i.e. murdering old people, MPs were delivering tearful performances like actors winning baubles at the Academy Awards. Beautiful writing from Noel Pearson, and he goes on to talk about this orgy of emotion that the MPs who push this sort of rubbish delight in. And finally, a really salient point, Daisy, Patrick Dodson pointed out to the Senate in 2018 that paving the way for euthanasia and assisted suicide leaves First Nations people even more vulnerable. Three very strong arguments there. Daisy, what did you make of Queensland's euthanasia laws?
Well, look, Euthanasia itself is one of those very difficult topics. You know, I do understand why people argue in favor of euthanasia. I mean, no one likes to see people suffering at the end of their lives. People often make the argument that, you know, you'd put down a beloved family pet if they're suffering. You don't leave animals to suffer like that. Why would you leave humans to suffer? And look, I get it, but at the end of the day, a human is not a pet. You know, there is a vast difference between pets and humans. And at the end of, aside from the sort of moral and ethical questions here, at the end of a human's life, there are monetary interests to consider. There's wills, there's estates, there's unscrupulous relatives, there's all sorts of things that can go wrong. So the devil really is in the detail with these laws. And look, aside from anything else, putting aside my own personal feelings about euthanasia, I'm not comfortable with it by any stretch of the imagination. But from a legal standpoint, why on earth would anyone want to put people's end of lives into the hands of the state, let alone the Queensland state government?
Exactly, James. James.
But there's another point. There's another point that is being missed in all of this. And I think what Noel Pearson said was absolutely correct. It's very sinister, but this is really where we're going to. Remember, for the last 2 years, we have all been told that we need to put our lives and our personal freedoms on hold. Why? To protect public health, the resources of the public health system, to protect hospitals, doctors, nurses from being overworked. Well, if this becomes the dominant attitude in society, that all of our lives are now subordinate to the needs of the public health system, what happens to our very elderly people? What happens to our frail, our vulnerable, who require an awful lot of care, use a lot of resources, especially at that end of life period? You know, I can easily see a situation where suddenly this all huge concern about saving very old people from a disease that takes mostly very old people suddenly becomes, you know, let's start having these conversations with very old people because we don't want them to be putting too much burden on the health system.
Well, let's cut to the...
Watch this switch. Watch this do 180 in the next year.
Well, let's cut to the chase. They'll want the beds. They'll want to empty the beds, so they'll bump people off. And that's already happening in the UK, a thing called the Liverpool Pathway, where they basically pump people full of morphine and starve them to death. That's been going on, very controversial over there in Britain. I wouldn't trust any of them. Having seen how our bureaucrats, health bureaucrats and politicians have behaved over COVID, I would not trust a single one of them with the life of an elderly person when it came to either resources or hospital beds or anything else. And New South Wales steer well clear of this rubbish. Now, because New South Wales is the next target. Now, speaking of COVID, we had all sorts of protests yesterday. I love the story from the in the Weekend Australian that businesses suddenly realised the National Cabinet was a huge mistake. Oh, really? Yes, guys, well done. Only 18 months later. It could have helped if you'd spoken up earlier. But anyway, let's just run through quickly. There have been demonstrations in Brisbane, in Perth, in Melbourne, horrible allegations that a 74-year-old woman was pushed over by the police and then on the ground. While she was down on the ground, she was capsicum sprayed. Some horrible scenes. We never know. We can't confirm whether these stories. We need to hear both sides of the story. But this is not Australia. This is unacceptable. These heavy-handed the police officers. There's a woman on the ground. She's on the ground, and two of them are spraying the capsicum spray. I mean, this is just unacceptable, and this is the result of heavy-handed authoritarianism that we warned about repeatedly over the last year on this show. James.
Well, I mean, I'm just looking at all these this footage of people demonstrating and rioting, and it just feels like some people just really don't appreciate being kept safe, which is, of course, all that Dan Andrews and the Victorian government is trying to do here, obviously. But, this is seriously really disturbing scenes. We've been told that we're all in this together when, from the very beginning, it's been so clear that we're not all in this together. People are having their lives destroyed, ruined. And now we have people talking about, oh, no, not 80%, but maybe 90% is where we need to get to before we really start to get back to normal. People are absolutely furious. Now, I don't condone the sorts of scenes that we saw in Victoria or elsewhere, but I also think that, policymakers need to understand they cannot keep pushing people. Melbourne is about to be the most locked down city in the history of the entire COVID pandemic, far longer than anywhere else, and they just expect people to cop it. Well, they're not, and you're going to get more and more scenes like this, ugly scenes, distressing scenes, and you're going to see bad things happen, like police get assaulted. That's very bad. We don't want that. But we also don't want is to have people's lives ruined, and we need to have governments that understand that they cannot keep treating people like they're in this experiment to see how long and how much they can take in the name of getting down to COVID zero, which frankly, Dan Andrews is still going for because he is still acting as if that is his plan, even if he has said otherwise.
Well, we had, I railed last week against vaccine passports. I think they're dreadful, and they are the cause of this division. People being forced or coerced into getting the vaccine. I'm not anti-vax. Go for it. Go for everybody. Be pro or anti-vax, whatever you want. But forcing people on the threat of losing their jobs is completely unacceptable. We had the Israeli health minister caught on a hot mic over the weekend, basically saying that imposing vaccine passport rules on certain venues is needed only, his words, to pressure members of the public to get vaccinated, and not for medical reasons. So basically, are we seeing the same thing here? Are we seeing, I think we are, we're seeing the threat of vaccine passports being used to push people, herd people into getting vaccinated. Well, that, I'm afraid, I think is unethical, but that's just my opinion. But we've had around the world, this is a huge issue. It tears people apart. So politicians who start playing with this are deliberately fostering division within our communities. Here's Canada, where firefighters and police, a demonstration of Canadian first responders, firefighters and police, basically had a huge, stand against mandatory vaccinations. We've seen that there. We've seen protests in France. We had a comedian in the United States, a left-wing comedian, saying he won't perform at venues that demand vaccine passports. We even had a Brisbane businessman putting up a sign saying that no one vaccinated was allowed into his shop. I mean, I think he was sort of poking fun at the idea. But this idea of mandatory vaccines, Italy has made it compulsory for all public and private workers. And yet in other places in the States, we see the complete opposite, where they're fining you if you do discriminate between the two. So it's clear that the authorities do not have a handle on this. What really disturbed me, Daisy, and I missed it last week, was Jackie Lambie coming out and basically threatening, it sounded to me like she was threatening people who, for whatever reason, chose not to get vaccinated. Have a listen.
I think you're going to find the rest of us coming at you lock, stock and barrel, and we're going to be putting the pressure on you fairly hard, because the rest of us that are trying to do the right thing by the country and our kids and get vaccinated and do the right thing, I think for you, we're going to start to get even more agitated, and we're going to start to get more hardcore.
We're coming at you lock, stock and barrel. Is Jackie Lambie inciting violence there or what, Daisy?
Well, this is completely inappropriate language for a politician to use about their own constituents. I mean, how dare Jackie Lambie sit there and say that? It reminds me of Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters, who so infamously yelled to her supporters, if you see any members of that Republican administration, you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome here. It is within exactly the same vein. It's disgraceful. She said that. And if any politicians are wondering why these protests are getting bigger and more intense and more violent, it's rhetoric like that from politicians, which is completely lacking in empathy, completely lacking in understanding, completely disparaging and entirely inappropriate, that are making people who are protesting feel that they are not only not being heard, but their voices deliberately squashed and misrepresented. And this is from a woman, Jackie, who will not lose a cent out of this lockdown. She's not going to lose a single thing. How dare she sit there and do that? It's disgusting.
Well, there you go. This is the division which our premiers are willfully playing with, and I wish Scott Morrison would show the same leadership he's shown on the French subs as regards saying that mandatory vaccination is un-Australian.
And you know what, Rowan, this is a direct consequence of Morrison and everybody else saying there will be no Freedom Day, there'll be no date when we just decide to open up, when in fact, actually, if they had done that from the start, said once we have a chance for everybody to decide whether or not they want to be vaccinated or not, and you can decide which side of the line you're going to fall on, and frankly, in a country like Australia, which has very high vaccination rates for just about everything else, you would assume that a lot of people would fall on one side rather than the other. They've created this situation now where they're being needlessly divisive, I think pushing people, into feeling like they're, being forced into things that they might not want to do, or look at the fact sets and come to different conclusions. If they're young, they might be saying, this really isn't a threat to me. And that's why you keep hearing all of the, oh, no, but this is dangerous for young people and all of this sort of thing. And of course, also, you again empower the public health people to simply say, everything now is about our rules and what we set, not what actually, is best for people and what the people want. You go from democracy to scientocracy, and that's where we are right now.
And Daisy, I was concerned by a letter sent to Queenslanders basically telling them that 12-year-olds, if I was reading the letter correctly, 12-year-olds can consent to getting the vaccine even if their parents might object to it. So I quote from this letter sent to Queenslanders. Individuals aged 12 to 15 years may require a parent guardian to provide consent, it says, but, however, young people seeking to provide informed consent themselves without parental consent should speak to their vaccinating clinician. Sounds like you don't need consent. Consent ain't consent when it comes to COVID. Daisy?
Look, it certainly seems like it. I find that letter extremely concerning. I mean, there's a reason we don't let 12-year-olds vote or drive or do any of those kinds of big things that adults do, and it's because they're 12. They're kids. So this is just strange from the Queensland state government. Probably they're worried that the vaccination rates are sort of a bit slower than the rest of the nation. There's not sort of an urgency up here to get it because we haven't been, whacked with the fear stick about vaccine passports. We've been whacked with the fear stick about other things, but vaccine passports certainly doesn't seem to be the one. And the thing is, on the point that James was making before, on Australia generally having very high vaccination rates, that's what I've thought this whole time. The vaccine passports, the threat of that should not be needed in Australia to coerce people into getting vaccinated. They just needed a good, positive advertising campaign from the start of the year, explaining the benefits, saying, we'd all love you to do this. And Australians who are very accepting of vaccines generally, I guarantee you would have jumped along. But this government coercion has created a hill for people to die on. I know so many people who are not anti-vax. They've had all their shots, who would be totally on board the COVID vax train if it was a nice positive advertising campaign, but they don't want to do it because on principle they can't stand the government coercion. It's a giant faux pas, and certainly what New South Wales is going to realise, I think they're going to hit a wall with vaccines soon because they'll hit that wall of people who just don't want to be jabbed.
Absolutely. Now, tomorrow night on Sky News, Sharri Markson has her long-anticipated special on Wuhan. Now, Sharri has been an absolute legend, a star around the world. They've been praising Sharri for the work she's done on the lab leak theory. This was this controversy last year. Many of us felt for sure, obviously the virus came out of the laboratory down the road rather than the bowl of bat soup. But no. The left said, no, you weren't allowed to say that. You couldn't suggest that the Chinese might be responsible. Sharri stuck to it. She did the research. She did the hard yards. And she joins us now on Outsiders. Sharri, how are you?
Good morning, Rowan. Thank you so much for those kind words.
Oh, my pleasure. Look, you've done so much work on this, and as I said, you've been lauded around the world, rightly so. Tell us, how did it begin? When did you first start on this? And that you must be exhausted. Tomorrow night's the big night it finally goes to air on Sky.
Look, I started looking into this in March last year. I was at the Daily Telegraph at the time, and I started investigating whether it's possible that the virus came from a laboratory. I interviewed intelligence officials, scientists, researchers who were all focused on this issue. And the more I looked into it, it became very clear that this is very possibly where the virus started, in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There was so much evidence. And then the more I kept digging into it, the story just started unraveling, and the cover-ups were extraordinary. The scientific journals who refused to publish the papers from people like Nikolai Petrovsky in Australia, other scientists as well, that questioned a natural origin. Then you had the media censorship as well. They were claiming this was a conspiracy. The tech giants censored it. And even, as I investigated this more, I discovered that even people in the State Department, in Pompeo's own department, who were looking at whether the lab leak was possible, met resistance from the intelligence agencies. So there's been a massive cover-up here, and it's taken us a long time to unpick all of the different elements and bring them together, which is what we've tried to do in the Sky documentary tomorrow night, and also in my book, which goes into more detail about many of these areas.
James?
Sherry, I'm so looking forward to the documentary and so looking forward to reading the book. And I've loved the reporting you've done every step of the way with this. But I want to ask you about the hesitancy to believe what would seem to be a pretty straightforward fact set. I mean, you've got a pandemic starting in a city that has an Institute of Virology that researches bat coronaviruses. It seems like pretty, a simple Occam's razor proposition. Why was so many people resistant to the theory? Was it that the Chinese had bought them off, or was it that there was just simply this idea that this was too terrible an idea to even contemplate?
Yeah. And not just that this lab was researching bat coronaviruses, but it has the world's largest collection of bat coronaviruses. It's extraordinary that this was dismissed as a conspiracy for so long. And the reason this isn't just a mistake, or it's not just chance that this happened. This was a concerted Chinese disinformation campaign. This is why China has its influence operations right around the world. So from the moment the pandemic started, you had scientists like Peter Daszak, who'd been working with the Wuhan Institute of Virology for 15 years and funding that lab with a subgrant from Fauci as well. So not just working with them, but funding them. And he secretly drafted and organised a letter to run in the distinguished journal The Lancet that said a lab leak was a conspiracy and was disinformation. I've also found out during the investigation for my book that he was the one briefing the intelligence agencies as well. So suddenly, before we even knew his role, this is how it started, and the media just gullibly went along with it. You also had the Trump factor, of course, that in April, Trump said that there was evidence for a lab leak because he was looking at intelligence. And of course, there was evidence for a lab leak. Joe Biden saw that when he got into office. But yet, because Trump said this, the mainstream media in the United States and unfortunately in Australia as well, we saw the ABC, it's so politicized. Because Trump had said it, they said, oh, it must be wrong. And so in an election year, this issue became highly politicized, which is such a tragedy, given we've now had 4.6 million people lose their lives. Those people deserve justice. That we need to know where the virus came from, not just dismiss the most likely option because Trump said it.
Absolutely. Well, Sherry, I hope that's a dog we can hear in the background and not a cage of baby bats that you're working on for your sequel. Can't wait for tomorrow night, particularly the Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo. That'll be absolutely sensational. Outsiders viewers will be tuning in there tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Monday. Sherry Marks and what really, really happened in Wuhan. Sherry, thanks. Enjoy the rest of your day and great work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Coming up, we've got James is going to take us for the latest on Donkey Vote, and we've got Gigi Foster to tell us about lockdown craziness.
Hello, you're watching Outsiders. I'm James Morrow here with Rowan Dean, and continuing to fill the shoes of Rita Panahi for just one more week, Daisy Cousins. And thank you for choosing to spend part of your Sunday with us here in Australia, where we have just signed a deal with the US and the UK to finally acquire nuclear subs, thanks to the wisdom and leadership of our Prime Minister.
I want to thank that fellow down under. Thank you very much, pal. Appreciate it, Mr. Prime Minister.
Well, whatever his name is. Anyway, well done, Scott Morrison. Now, I know on this show we often say that we are bringing you the stories the so-called mainstream press and woke political establishment don't want you to hear about or see. Well, Have a look at this extraordinary footage that Fox News obtained from Del Rio, Texas, on the southern border of the United States, where thousands and thousands of illegal migrants, mostly Haitians trying to make their way into the United States via Mexico, have been streaming in every single day.
Stunning footage out of Del Rio, Texas on Thursday as our Fox flight team drone shows thousands of migrants crammed under the international bridge, waiting to be processed after crossing illegally into the United States. Our drone spotted masses of migrants crossing from Ciudad Acuña, Mexico, over a dam in the Rio Grande and into the United States illegally. They then stream into Del Rio via a dirt path, hundreds coming by the hour with more on the way every day.
Scenes like this have been repeated across the border for months now, pretty much ever since the Biden administration loosened Trump-era policies demanding that would-be migrants be processed in Mexico on that side of the border, and instead returned to the failed catch-and-release policies of the bad old days, where migrants are released into communities without so much as a COVID test and only on a promise of showing up to a hearing at some later date. Well, actions have consequences. In August, the U.S. Border Patrol recorded over 208,000 so-called encounters with would-be migrants. This was the second month in a row that figure was over 200,000 encounters. Keeping in mind for that every known, quote, encounter, there may be 2 or 3 more who slip in with no contact at all. And here's the kicker. That 208,000 figure represents an increase of 317% from the previous August when a certain bad orange man was in the Oval Office. Well, hope and change, right? So, what did the Biden administration choose to do about this disaster? Well, faced with the bad optics of drone footage that revealed the extent of the crisis at the border, they didn't decide to change tack or get tough or even, God help us, end the insane policies that have created this mess. No. Officials got on the phone to the Federal Aviation Administration and had them issue a temporary ban on drone flights in the area. But here's where it gets really good. This didn't thwart the Fox News journalists from getting the footage. They simply got themselves a chopper, and not just one hired by the company, but one provided by local law enforcement. You know, the people who have to deal with the mess created by Biden's policies so they could show the world what is going on. Have a look at this.
Look at the mass of people down there. This time 2 days ago, there were just over 4,000 people. There are now upwards of 11,000. We are talking nearly a tripling of the numbers. That Mexican town that you're looking across the river, that is Ciudad Acuña. That is the Mexican city where all these migrants are gathering. And you can see they're using this dam right here to walk across the Rio Grande and enter the United States illegally. They then use a dirt path that's right below us, and they stream into the International Bridge area.
Again, as I say, any government, any regime faced with this sort of crisis pretty much has 2 options. They can either act to do something about it, or they can simply try to stop you from finding out about it. Guess which option the Biden administration chose? That they chose to try and hide it is pretty telling. That local cops are now helping the press expose it is even more so.
That's brilliant, James. And just before the break, you would have seen this photo flash up on the screen. That is Joe Biden, James and Daisy, doing what he loves best, ignoring the immigration crisis that James was talking about and standing with a bunch of kids. Trouble is, if you look closely, he hasn't noticed that the kids are wearing Trump and Make America Great hats. Unbelievable. The bloke is so unaware. It's extraordinary. Anyway, I thought we'd share that with you. Now, speaking of lockdowns, as we were, vaccine passports, all those sorts of things. Gigi Foster has been a professor with the School of Economics at the University of New South Wales. She is the co-author of a book that's just been released called The Great COVID Panic. What happened? Why and what to do next? Gigi has spoken out repeatedly about the social and economic costs that we are ignoring of lockdowns. Professor Gigi Foster joins us now. Gigi, great to see you. How are you?
Very good, Rowan. Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, you put a lot of work into this book. Basically, you look at, you're an economist, so you approach it from the cost-benefit analysis. So just give us the broad concerns you had that led you to writing the book in the first place.
Well, last year, Ron, I felt very frustrated with the fact that the government that was giving us these draconian policy prescriptions was not backing them with any sort of cost-benefit analysis, any rational thought about why they were expected to deliver benefits on net. And I waited and finally in August produced a kind of draft cost-benefit analysis for the Victorian Parliament as a proof of concept. Even then, I don't think it was taken on. And I just continued to feel so frustrated, not just with that, but with the broader picture of what was happening. There was this fear mongering going on and a continuation of obsession about a virus, which it looked from the data for most healthy people was hardly more dangerous than a standard flu virus. And so myself and my two co-authors, Paul Frieders and Michael Baker, decided that we just had to write this story down from the perspective of economists, but really broad-minded economists. So we don't just cover the lockdown policies in this book. We cover the entire era from an historical and a psychological and a sociological and a political and a scientific perspective. So we do feel it's a bit of a cathartic effort, and we hope that it helps people who have been puzzled to see what they've seen during this period.
And Gigi, you use a great kind of literary device. You have different characters, fictitious characters, but they're obviously based on real people you've observed and how they react. And a great part of the book is that you detail how different people and different types, and this has been fascinating, have reacted to things like, being told to dob on your neighbours and these sorts of things that we thought were long past. We're back in the dark days of the 1930s, but you've exposed, particularly, tell me about the character Jane and how she needs these restrictions.
Yeah, so Rowan, the three characters are Jane, James, and Jasmine. And Jane is the scared one. The population as a whole in Australia in March would have been well described by Jane, I think, most of the people. And she is so terrified and petrified of what she is perceiving as a great threat from the social media and just what she hears from her friends overseas, that she demands of the politicians that they protect her from this threat. And the politicians, particularly here in Australia, but many other places as well, wholly failed to provide actual leadership during this period and basically caved in to the demands of Jane to protect her with increasing numbers of restrictions in various different areas. And of course, those shelter-in-place orders were just one of these. We are now seeing the most recent version of this, which is these crazy vaccination mandates. And those politicians then continued to do this. And Jane, as the crisis continued, became their long arm. She became a vigilante and was the person who was dobbing others in for having parties or having a hug or doing something that was, supposedly against the rules, not wearing a mask. And so in that way, the politician's power was increased through her actions. And it was very much Jane who started it off and has continued it, and to whom the politicians continue today even to pander, particularly in Australia.
And James Morrow, I won't mean the James in the book. James, a question for Gigi.
Well, Gigi, I'm really curious then, how did we come to this situation where this Jane, or the Janes of Australia, wound up taking control, essentially, of the entire public health debate? And are you worried that we are now moving from a situation where we're no longer really a democratic society, but one where our democratic leaders are now constantly in thrall, deferring to public health experts? Oh, it's the health advice. I'm just going to take the health advice and all of that we keep hearing, when if these lockdowns worked, we wouldn't have to keep going into them.
Indeed. Well, let me make clear, it's not just Jane. So James, unfortunately, sorry about the name, James is another very
Can't think who you had in mind.
So James is the archetype of the opportunist. He is the one who sees advantage in the Jane's paralysis and petrification. And he was both in government and in industry during this period and has basically exploited the fear of the population. And so instead of actually acting in the best interests of the people he was often elected to protect, he has indulged himself basically with the power and the control that has been available to him, and has just caved into this pressure from the panicked population and has done deals, has made lots of money. I mean, the PPE manufacturers, for example, the vaccine manufacturers, the government positions, Brett Sutton, I think, was a sex symbol for quite a long time. This kind of power is very, very seductive. It's an aphrodisiac. And so the James all around have been a big part of keeping this going. Now, are we still a democratic state? Well, what I see is an increasing narrowness of what is accepted to say, what is accepted in terms of how you must think, how you must comport yourself. There are certain very, very strict rules, and the diversity of opinion and that diversity of perspective and thought has been squashed. And that, to me, is one of the biggest worries. It's not, democracy as a whole. It's really even bigger than that. It's the inability for individual people to express themselves and be respected in our society. And this vaccination, non-vaccination mandate thing, this is just going right along with the same pattern we've seen in history, as you say, of how to divide people. The blacks and the whites, the Jews and the Aryans, the witches and the, non-witches, the heretics and the crusaders. We know in history that people have divided, themselves, and it has been destructive and horrific. And that's what I'm seeing yet again here. It's a rhetoric of division rather than a rhetoric of unity, which is where the strength comes from. Unity in diversity. So that's what I'm hoping that we can build back towards.
Absolutely, and I'll just make clear, you're not suggesting Brett Sutton has made money, just that he was a sex symbol during COVID, which seems to be a strange thing. Daisy, quick last question for Gigi.
Well, look, on the subject of whether we're still a democratic state, it seems to me that the Janes of society are so happy to have these restrictions because they have sort of absolute faith that governments will just hand all their freedoms back to them. But that's flawed thinking, isn't it, when you consider the history of governments?
Indeed, yes. And it's funny that people who suggest that perhaps people in government and people in industry might be taking advantage of the situation and acting in their own interests rather than the people's are considered conspiracy theorists, that we have been labeled conspiracy theorists. And I have to say, if you don't understand how politics work, then you're pretty ignorant. It's not a conspiracy to believe that people are following their own greedy interests. And so, indeed, that is a very troubling sort of ignoramus kind of position that has been very, very popular these days. And I hope that it doesn't continue to possess everyone here in Australia.
Gigi Foster, Professor Gigi Foster, thanks so much. Your book, I urge people to look it up, get it on Amazon, go for it, or wherever. The Great COVID Panic, there it is. And great work there, Gigi. Well done, and we'll speak to you again soon. Thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. And pleasure. And coming up, Wackademia, Lefty Lunacy, in a tick. Well, Lefty Lunacy, they don't get madder than our premiers when it comes to Lefty Lunacy. One bloke is the bloke in Canberra, Daisy and James. Andrew Barr, his name is. He's the, whatever they're called there, the Chief Minister or something or other. Apparently he's more concerned, James, at who is asking the questions, what organisation they belong to, and heaven help us if they belong to Sky.
Anyway,
the Sky News ones?
These are the statistics. I don't know why you keep referring to my organisation pejoratively.
Well, I know. I'm just pointing out where you're from. That's all, and people are interested in that.
The weekly average on our website and the ABC's, if you prefer that, is a 20-day gap between the national achievement of that and the ACT's achievement of that.
Based on a rolling seven-day average of.
So why is it always Sky, James? It's Peter Credlin and Gabrielle and the others, Rachel, the others down in Melbourne who have to hold Dan Andrews to account. It's Tom in Canberra. Well, what's it about Sky seems to be on top of all this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems to me that Sky seems to be the only network that goes out and asks tough questions of premiers and chief ministers or the mayor of Canberra or whatever it is that that our friend over there was. But, it's such a beat up, I have to say, because, yeah, sure, they've gone after Dan Andrews. He's a lefty in Melbourne. They've gone after Gladys Berejiklian in Sydney, and she is purportedly somebody who's on the right. So, this idea that somehow Sky News is pushing pushing some particular agenda. Well, no. This guy got caught out because the numbers and the facts revealed that his coronavirus response has just been appalling, and he's got the whole city locked down. And so instead of saying, well, yeah, I got it wrong, he says, oh, hey, Sky News, how dare you question me? Sky News!
Daisy, I don't know how you show your face around Brisbane, working for the dreadful Sky News, Now, listen, let's change a bit of lefty lunacy from Virginia. What a surprise. Virginia Tech syllabus. One of the instructors there has apologised for their white skin. Daisy, tell us about this.
Yes, this is a very sort of sorry story, very typical university thing. This instructor has put in the syllabus a little disclaimer that says, I am a Caucasian cisgender female and first-generation college student from Appalachia who is of Scottish, British and Norwegian heritage, so she's very white. I'm married to a cisgender male and we are middle class. How dare she be married to a cisgender male? And then she says, I did not ask for the many privileges in my life. I have benefited from them and will continue to benefit from them whether I like it or not. She goes on, yada, 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 sick. And then she says at the end, and to my students of colour, I apologise for the inexcusable horrors within our shared history. Oh my God. Never mind the fact that this was a college class on disabilities, nothing to do with politics. I mean, joyless, totally joyless.
James, the great Neil Brown sent me this one, an ad for Darebin Council, who appear to be fighting racism with racism. They're advertising, James, this is a Melbourne local council, who are advertising for an anti-racism program officer, but they go out of their way to point out that the job only Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and or people from a culturally and linguistically diverse background are eligible to apply to this position. So, James, how do you fight racism with racism?
Well, it's very simple. Obviously, Rowan, if you're going to be against racism, that you have to understand that different races have different characteristics, and some races are guilty of historical crimes and need to be punished for them, and other races don't, and they need to be elevated, and that's how you be anti-racist. Do I need to draw you a picture, Rowan?
Beautiful. Well, we're going to take a short break, but coming up, I'm going to reveal the Manchurian Candidate at the ABC in a tick. Hello, you're watching Outsiders with James Morrow, Daisy Cousins and myself, Rowan Dean. And thank you so much for watching Outsiders every Sunday morning and yet again making us the #1 show on Sky News Australia. Thank you. It's not us doing it, it's you. Well, I think it's time to reveal the truth. I've tried to hide it, I've tried to keep it under wraps, but I'm afraid our cover is blown. You see, for several years now, I have been working on a secret project to undermine the ABC from within. It's been clear for the past decade that the ABC is beyond redemption, a massive drain on taxpayers' money and nothing more than a propaganda arm for the hard left in this country. What to do about it? Well, I decided we needed a Manchurian Candidate, a secret spy who didn't even realise he was a spy, to burrow deep into the ABC and work his way up to the highest echelons. Like all decent Manchurian candidates, this man isn't even aware that he's a Manchurian candidate.
Raymond?
Yes, sir.
Can you see the Red Queen?
Yes, sir.
Good.
It's as if he's in a hypnotic trance most of the time. But then when I slip in the secret code word onto Outsiders, I can't tell you what it is, I'm afraid. It triggers an automatic response in him, and he immediately starts running Outsiders material on his show on the ABC in order to reach a whole new audience and encourage all the lovies to see complicated political issues from a different, conservative point of view. It's the perfect plot. My Manchurian Candidate has already run many Outsiders segments many times on the ABC now, but I'm afraid last Monday he just couldn't help himself. And I'm sad to say he got so carried away he completely blew his cover. Yes, the time has come to confess. Paul Barry on Media Watch is in fact my Manchurian candidate at the ABC, even though he himself doesn't realise it. Last week, as usual on Outsiders, I uttered the secret code word and voila! It worked a treat. Half of Paul Barry's Media Watch program was devoted to Outsiders, including accurately quoting my thoughts on Scott Morrison's ludicrous plans for Australia to reach net zero emissions.
In the past, it's called net zero insanity, stupid, ridiculous, rubbish, nonsense, and economic suicide.
I couldn't have put it better myself, Paul. And you can bet plenty of viewers sat up and thought, hello, we don't get that sort of truth-telling very often on the ABC. But my Manchurian, or should that be my Ultimo candidate, didn't stop there. Risking blowing his cover entirely, he then did me the great honour of digging up and replaying one of my very, very, very favourite clips from Outsiders back in 2017.
So, what should we expect? Something like this, perhaps, from Rowan Dean?
This Sunday, we're going to solve climate change just there.
Just here?
It's gone up by about 1 millimetre.
Rising sea levels. You got it?
I've got it. 3 mil.
If News Corp is about to take global warming seriously, rather than just on its younger aiming website news.com.au, it really would be something.
We had a lot of fun filming that clip, and Mr. Barry is 100% correct when he says we must take climate change very seriously. So seriously that we actually went to the effort of filming that clip on one of the beaches adjacent to Coleroy Beach, where you can clearly see by comparing photos from as early as 1907, where you can see the fisherman's hut there circled. And again, here is the same view in 2014, with no change whatsoever in over 100 years in beach morphology. Indeed, here is the beach in 1936, and again in the 1950s, and again in 2014. And in all these images, the high water mark comes to within 1.5 metres or so of the grassy bank. But there are no observable effects of any sea level rise or indeed coastal erosion in any of those images. And my thanks to Jeff and Helen Derrick for providing those photos. So our spoof film satirising sea level rises is in fact based on observable evidence. So yes, I take alarmist and unproven claims by the ABC and others about catastrophic climate change and rising sea levels very seriously indeed, which is why I produce the Ice Age Watch segment on this show every single week, in which, in the manner that all decent journalists, satirists, and even scientists should do, and the ABC used to do, I attempt to highlight, rightly or wrongly, observable evidence that questions and contradicts the prevailing political and cultural orthodoxy on global warming. Indeed, Mr. Barry clearly spends a great deal of time watching Outsiders, as he should, but last Monday he really did give the game away.
Today, as if to prove they won't be gagged, Sky's Rowan Dean served up his regular Ice Age watch on Outsiders.
I've been on the planet a fair few decades now, and the weather doesn't seem all that different to when I was a little kid. Indeed, it sometimes appears colder. Indeed, according to Electroverse, South Africa has had a brutally cold winter this year. In Japan, the iconic Mount Fuji's first snowcap of the season has arrived a good 4 weeks earlier.
So the big question is, will commentators like Rowan Dean, Chris Kenny, Peter Credlin, Alan Jones, Tim Blair, Miranda Devine, Andrew Bolt and Terry McCrann now change their tune on global warming?
That's a very good question, Paul. And thank you, by the way, for giving a shout out to some of Australia's very, very finest journalists and commentators. Well done. But again, my Manchurian candidate makes a very valid point. Unlike the ABC, you can't predict what journalists and commentators at Sky are going to say, because we are all free-thinking individuals capable of agreeing or disagreeing with each other. Some may well change their minds about net zero or global warming. Others may not. I don't know. With any luck, stunned ABC viewers might be intrigued to go and read some of the articles by those Paul Barry kindly named. Maybe take out a Sky subscription, or a Spectator Australia subscription for that matter, so they can get real diversity, a diversity of points of view. Or am I being unfair? Last week, you will remember, I made the point that I am passionately opposed to mandatory vaccines, not on public health grounds, but on ethical grounds. I understand the public health argument, but there is a higher argument, a moral and ethical one that in a democracy we should expect our politicians to consider. So I was pleased to hear this dissenting point of view from someone I normally disagree with, someone on the left of politics, the project's Waleed Ali, speaking on the ABC.
So one of the, I think, more maddening aspects of our pandemic politics is that we watched leader after leader get up and say, we're just following the health advice. And we as a country have said, that's great, that's exactly what you should do. But actually, that's not the job of a politician. The politician's job is not to follow health advice. Their job is to take health advice, consider it, place it in its proper context with a whole suite of other imperatives that are non-health imperatives as well as health imperatives, and then come to a decision. There is no health advice that can give you an answer on what an acceptable level of death, or particularly death, an acceptable level of death is. That's not a health advice question, that's a political and ethical question.
An ethical question. Allow me to say, well done, Waleed. I couldn't have put it better myself. But maybe my Manchurian Candidate hypnotic drug got into the water cooler over there at the project too. Because on the same topic, I was delighted to hear project panellist Kate Langbroek arguing with the insufferable Hamish MacDonald, claiming the concept behind vaccine passports in the workplace, where you in essence excommunicate individuals, is, and she is right, repugnant.
Bringing in COVID into the workplace is not safe.
I know, and you would like to think that everyone that you work with would make that decision, but if they haven't made that decision, I can't in good conscience go along with what they can't work.
Well, they can work, but maybe they have to work from home.
If you have the right to go into your workplace and feel protected, does someone else not also have the right to decide what they put into their body?
Hear, hear, what a legend. And while I'm dishing out the praise to the lovies, I have to say I was encouraged and also perturbed by the comments from former Deputy Chief Health Officer Nick Coatsworth.
So this is how you do it. You make them temporary. They're not going to be around forever. They're designed specifically to increase uptake rates, and they don't exclude full participation in society.
As far as I'm concerned, as I said last week, vaccine passports, which Nick was talking about, are an abomination and will lead to ugly divisions and do irreparable harm to our communities. Countries like Britain, Denmark and many US states have scrapped, and some have even outlawed the idea of vaccine passports altogether. What is clear is that the threat of them is being used as a tool to manipulate those who are otherwise hesitant about getting vaccinated, and I find that dishonest and disgraceful. But as Nick Coatsworth suggests, if vaccine passports are to go ahead, they must be limited in terms of time, 2 to 3 weeks max, with a legislated cut-off point, and in terms of scope, they must be limited to just large venues and events of, say, over 500 or 1,000 people, as opposed to the indefinite blanket usage for all businesses and local communities that John Barilaro and Gladys Berejiklian so shamefully proclaimed last week. Ultimately, as Kate Langbroek pointed out, if vaccines work, then it shouldn't matter if other people are vaccinated or not. I stress, I am not anti-vaccinations. I am anti-mandatory vaccinations and anti-vaccine passports. The case for vaccine passports is argued by some on the premise that the vaccines prevent the virus from spreading. That is something that appears to be highly debatable. Even the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has argued that the vaccines do not prevent transmission of the Delta variant. Here is CDC Director Rochelle Walensky on CNN in August.
Our vaccines are working exceptionally well. They continue to work well for Delta with regard to severe illness and death. They prevent it. But what they can't do anymore is prevent transmission. So if you're going home to somebody who has not been vaccinated, to somebody who can't get vaccinated, somebody who might be immunosuppressed or a little bit frail, somebody who has comorbidities that put them at high risk, I would suggest you wear a mask in public indoor settings.
CNN also said this at the same time.
The CDC revealing tonight that 74% of COVID cases in Barnstable County, Massachusetts, home to Provincetown, where there was a recent outbreak, were found in people who were fully vaccinated. And they say now that the vaccinated are just as likely to spread the virus as those who are not vaccinated. And that, of course, is contrary to what was widely known.
One thing we have learnt is that the expert advice does change often with alarming rapidity in the era of COVID. That doesn't mean the experts are wrong, but it doesn't mean they are always right either. If our state premiers do go down the path of blanket all-encompassing vaccine passports, they risk doing untold damage to the mental health, social cohesion, livelihoods and economic well-being of the people of Australia. Not something any politician wants on their scorecard when it comes to re-election, and we will remind people of you. Speaking of which, one thing the left and the lovies have always told us that they hate are four-word slogans. I wonder what you call this then?
Or a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
Pandemic of the unvaccinated.
And a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
Absolutely a pandemic of the unvaccinated.
Just a coincidence, I imagine. Still, it's a nifty little phrase. I wonder which ad guru thought that one up. Well, John Hinderaker is president of the Centre of the American Experiment and editor of the excellent Powerline blog, which I urge all outsiders to go to at powerlineblog.com. John is a regular here on Outsiders, and he joins us now from the United States.
Hi, Rowan. Great to be with you.
Great to see you, John. Now, we've got a few things we want to chat to you about, but firstly, I was intrigued. You reviewed on your excellent Powerline blog a book called Rigged about, the American election in 2020. Now, you and I have discussed this, and we've discussed this on the show before, but give us the rundown on this book and your thoughts on it.
Well, of course, as you know, Ron, there's been so much controversy about the 2020 election. A lot of Republicans believe that it was stolen. My own view, and the view of this book that you mentioned, is not that it was stolen through the Dominion voting machines and some of the legerdemain that some have alleged. But the election was heavily influenced and, in fact, rigged by a number of factors. Number one, the mainstream conventional press suppressed stories that were damaging to the Joe Biden campaign, like, for example, the Hunter Biden laptop that included evidence that Joe Biden is a corrupt politician. That was just suppressed. Two, social media. The social media giants did the same thing, skewing conversation to pro-Democrat, anti-Republican themes. Three, in a number of states, including my state of Minnesota, collusive, fraudulent litigation was used to illegally change voting laws to make it easier to commit voter fraud. It's a scandal that has been underreported. And then finally, Rowan, Mark Zuckerberg contributed hundreds of millions of dollars to cities and counties around the country to hire Democratic Party activists to administer their elections. And this went on in big cities all across the country. So there were a number of factors at play, and it led to a really dishonest election.
Yeah, and Time magazine boasted about it. James.
The big news here, John, and thanks for joining us, is in Australia is this new submarine deal between Australia, the United States, and the UK. I want to ask you a couple of things about that. Number one, to what extent is this on the radar of Americans, this new alliance with Australia and the UK? And number two, what is the reaction to Joe Biden now having apparently gotten the French very offside with the way that he dealt with this, and the French ambassador to Washington being recalled? They've recalled their ambassador to Australia as well. But is this being seen as another foreign policy blunder by the Biden administration?
Well, first of all, James, AUKUS has not gotten as much press in the United States as it deserves. China's military expansion in the Pacific is a huge, huge issue. And this is an important step that's being taken to try to combat that expansionism. And it has not gotten the play in the American press that it deserves. I'm not sure how many people are blaming Joe Biden for the fact that France is mad because its submarine deal got canceled. My own view is that that was inevitable and a good thing. I mean, I think that was a solid judgment by the Australians. I think what Joe Biden has mainly taken grief for in the U.S. is forgetting the name of your prime minister. Well, the prime minister is on the screen and Biden is talking to him, and that's a little bit embarrassing. You know, he didn't have the name on a teleprompter, and Joe Biden without a teleprompter is completely lost. But I will say, in his defense, he did remember Boris Johnson's name. So 1 out of 2 for Joe Biden is not too bad.
Fantastic. Daisy.
Now, look, John, you mentioned that the election was stolen, shall we say, by certain legislative changes that made it easier for Democrats to cheat rather than Dominion. I couldn't agree more, but one of the theories I've heard is that the massive Democratic emphasis on mail-in voting plus lowering the standards for the acceptance of ballots could have contributed as well. What do you think of that theory?
Well, I think it's absolutely correct. I mean, the number of mail-in ballots, I don't remember the exact number, but millions and millions and millions. That's how I think most people voted in this election. In my state, as a result of collusive litigation that was immediately settled by our Democratic Secretary of State, it was a fraudulent lawsuit. They illegally eliminated the requirement that signatures on mail-in ballots be witnessed. So now if you got your hands on a ballot, you don't even have to have somebody witness your signature. You just sign somebody else's name and put it in the mail. And there's no way to know. Nobody knows how many fraudulent ballots got cast as a result of that kind of loosening of standards. But obviously some did, and we'll never know how many.
Yeah, exactly. Now, John, this General Milley character, you've written about him. So Donald Trump came out last week basically saying, this is the story where General Milley admitted that he would have, or the claim is that he would have phoned his Chinese counterparts if Donald Trump were to declare war on China. He would have phoned the Chinese to let them know in advance. That's roughly the story. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about it. But Donald Trump has accused this general of treason. And you, a lawyer, one of America's best lawyers, you've been voted, has agreed. He's guilty as charged.
Well, the story here is that Bob Woodward, who's not always a reliable source, has written a book, and it came out that in this book, Woodward writes that Milley contacted his counterparts at the top levels of the Chinese military and told them that if President Trump were ever going to attack China, he would give them advance warning, advance notice, so they would know about it. And Woodward also reported that Milley called a meeting of senior military officials in the U.S. and reminded them that if President Trump were to try to pass any illegal orders down the chain of command, they shouldn't be followed. Well, I read this and I thought that can't possibly be right. No American military man would call up the Chinese and say, don't worry, if we're ever planning on attacking you, I'll let you know. But then the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which Milley heads, their spokesman put out a statement that basically admitted that the story was true. And he said that Milley had been reassuring the Chinese. Well, yeah, it would certainly reassure them to know that they can't be attacked without prior warning from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. And how our military could have declined to the point where a man like Milley could be the senior officer in the entire U.S. Armed Forces, it's absolutely shocking.
James?
But doesn't this also really play into the narrative, putting aside the 2020 election aside, that from the very start of his presidency, Donald Trump was basically the victim of a slow-motion, rolling bureaucratic coup that was attempting to undermine him at every stage of the game. I mean, it's so funny to contrast the treatment that Milley's getting versus, the treatment of, say, Vindman, and the way these guys are all considered as sort of heroes because of their undermining of a legitimate democratically elected president.
Well, I would say, James, it goes back to before the election. I think that the first major effort here was this Russia collusion hoax.
Yeah.
And this was started by Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee, and it was collaborated in by the FBI and the CIA, by the Washington Post, the New York Times, the entire American media establishment. And they kept this hoax going for years, even though they knew it was a lie. And this is one of the biggest scandals in American political history. It's not the only instance, but it's sort of the grandfather of them all, of how these people conspired first to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president and then to disable his administration once he did become president.
And John, just very quickly before we go, you mentioned, how could a bloke like Milley be head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, head of the Army? That he was the same bloke who was busy running around with critical race theory concepts and ideas of white privilege and gender fluidity and all this garbage. We have the same problem with the military in Australia. Ooh, better not tell the Chinese that. John, just very, very quickly, critical race theory, you've written on Powerline blog. The Biden administration are making it, if you don't believe in it, then you're out. Is that right?
Well, critical race theory, it's unbelievable. It's in the military, it's in the government, it's even in corporate America. We see in the United States employees being fired because they refuse to undergo so-called training that would inflict critical race theory on them, teach them that whites are no good, that America's a racist, white supremacist country, and on and on. And there are many places in America where you have to at least pretend to believe that, or it's going to be hard to hang on to your job.
Unbelievable. John Heinderacre, always great to chat to you on Outsiders. Thanks so much. And we'll speak to you soon. And I urge Outsiders to go to thepowerlineblog.com. Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Ron. Bye-bye.
Bye. Coming up, it's Daisy's Doozy in a tick.
Welcome back. You're watching Outsiders. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian lauded herself this week over the latest easing of restrictions. 5 fully vaccinated people can meet for an outdoor activity like a picnic. It's apparently a taste of what is to come, vaccine passports, or, in more colourful terms, the introduction of a caste system of the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, the clean and unclean, if you will, in which the vaccinated can participate fully in society while the unvaccinated are ostracised from public consciousness. Premier Berejiklian has been drumming into the New South Wales public for weeks that if they haven't had their first and second jab when that 70 and 80% vaccine thresholds are met, they can expect to live a sort of half-life.
So you have been warned. If you're not vaccinated, come forward and get the vaccine. Otherwise, you won't be able to participate in the many freedoms that people have at 70% vaccination.
This has prompted a surge in people coming forward for the jab. After all, who wants to have their freedom permanently restricted by electing not to be part of the clean caste, the superior vaccinated caste? Because it would be permanent, wouldn't it? That's what Berejiklian seems to have been implying. No light at the end of the tunnel has been hinted at for those who elect to remain in the unclean, untouchable, unvaccinated caste. This rhetoric has worked very well for New South Wales politicians and their vaccine rollout. Until Monday morning, that is, when Deputy Premier John Barilaro went right off script.
What we've said with the 70% roadmap, there'll be businesses that don't like the idea either, but the 70% roadmap gives us an opportunity to open the economy and lift restrictions. And we can do that in a safe way for vaccinated people and vaccinated businesses or organisations. And if they don't want to do it, that's fine. But you might have to wait another 3 to 4 weeks after that when we get to 80% and above. We've said that according to the national roadmap and to the Doherty Institute report, we'll go and then lift further restrictions, including for the unvaccinated.
Well. Are you telling us that these vaccine passports, portrayed for weeks as the green ticket to freedom, will only be compulsory for 3 or 4 weeks? That's a rather awkward change of course for Gladys's government, which the Premier seemed to realise. She fronted up to a press conference just a few hours later to seemingly say the opposite.
The Deputy was on the radio this morning saying when we get to 8%, the unvaccinated will have the same level of freedoms. You're saying something else this morning.
I'm saying the government, thank you for that question. The government has not yet confirmed what will occur at 80% double dose vaccination. We're still working on those plans. I don't want people to think they can sit back, let everybody else do the hard work, and then turn up when it's 80% and get everything else that vaccinated people are. That is not the right message. I want to say very clearly that if you're not vaccinated, you will not have the freedom or the freedoms that vaccinated people have, even when we get to 80% double dose.
And yet, somehow, in attempting to distance herself from Barilaro's comments, she, in the same breath, affirmed them.
Well, it might not even be a decision for government. As I said, private businesses, private organisations may make the decision that they don't want to welcome unvaccinated people.
Goodness gracious, Gladys. Despite her desperately trying to maintain that carefully crafted veneer of no jab, no life, the proverbial mask has slipped. It appears none of this is intended to be permanent, despite the relentless governmental guilt-tripping. But could it have been simply a slip of the tongue from Berejiklian under pressure? Seemingly not. Here's what the Premier said on Sky News 2 days later.
We appreciate a lot of small businesses are literally hanging on by a thread, and obviously the compliance regime that we'd expect them to have in place would be very different to a major event organiser or large establishments that have lots of people coming through all the time.
Would you believe it? It turns out the New South Wales state government has been bullying and terrorising its citizens, not to mention the rest of Australia, into having a medical procedure they may not ordinarily choose to have under false pretenses. Contrary to what the public has been led to assume, this is not going to be some blanket anti-freedom government decree. This is just handing it over to the free market. And in true free market style, the market will decide. For my money, businesses who welcome all customers, fully jabbed or not, will likely do a hell of a lot better than those who self-righteously turn away 20% of their clientele. You don't need to be a genius to work out which model most businesses will likely follow. But all levity aside, this is a serious betrayal by the Berejiklian government. How dare they so flippantly lie by omission like this after so cruelly and gratuitously crushing their citizens with this ridiculous lockdown? Talk about adding insult to injury. How dare they so callously barter with the rights and freedoms of the people of New South Wales, as if those rights are merely chips for politicians to play with, sweeties for state mummy to dole out to the kiddies when they've been good little boys and girls. How perverse. People of New South Wales, you have been betrayed by your state leaders. Do not forget that, and do not forgive them.
Great stuff, Daisy. And in a tick, we'll be talking to someone who agrees with you wholeheartedly and, in fact, left New South Wales because of those very reasons. But first, war on women. Just very quickly, James, transgenderism in sports, we've argued against that for so long, but now it's got to the most ridiculous and ghastly, ugly situation.
Well, yeah, we saw this MMA fight in Florida, I believe it was, where a transgender fighter, Alana McLaughlin, who had spent 6 years in the Special Forces as a male, then went and had this match with another fighter, 32-year-old Celine Provost, and essentially just destroyed her in the ring. It was just an appalling spectacle. And then, after this whole thing, you've got the poor loser of this fight, just down there, just completely absolutely shattered after this experience, being thrown into a cage with somebody who had spent much of their life as a male in a very incredibly physical arena of the special forces. And then the winner is standing there in a tank top that says, "End trans genocide." And it's like, sorry, what? You're saying that you're the victim here? And in fact, where is this trans genocide that's taking place anywhere in the world? The whole thing was frankly a disgrace. It's, of course, the end point of this whole fight over trans sports. And what happens to women is that, they get not only erased, but also seriously hurt potentially.
Absolutely. Well, our next guest is a successful lawyer who was born in Argentina but has spent most of his life in Australia and New Zealand. He holds a Master of Comparative Jurisprudence from New York University. His name is Ezekiel Trumper, and we've invited him on the show today following the letter I read out last week by a friend of mine, Patrick, also a lawyer, by the way, who was threatening to leave Australia if our governments persist with these totalitarian approaches to COVID. Well, Ezekiel Trumper isn't just threatening to abandon Australia, he has done it. He told his wife that he had lived through one dictatorship when he was growing up in Argentina, and he was not going to live through a second one here in Australia. So they've upped stumps and they've moved to Florida. Ezekiel Trumper joins us now. Ezekiel, how are you?
I'm very good, thank you. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Okay, Ezekiel, so tell us a little bit about your background in Argentina, the dictatorship there, and the parallels you saw occurring here in Australia in the last year.
Well, I lived through a dictatorship between my age 16 and age 24. I left after that. I did not leave because of the dictatorship, but because I couldn't. But I found myself in Australia, a country which I thought would be free, common sense, easygoing. And I simply was not prepared to live in a militarized, brutal police state, which is what Australia has become. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. I don't want to be harsh. I'm very grateful. I spent 21 years practicing law in Australia, 12 years in New Zealand. But I said to myself, I own my life, and I'm not going to let any politician own it for me.
Now, Ezekiel, you made a couple of points. One, when you were in quarantine, you wanted to know what the legal exemption was for the Prime Minister being allowed to home quarantine, where you were in what you described as worse than a jail-like situation. Did you ever get a satisfactory answer to that?
No. I flew back to Australia on the 8th of July. I was fully vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine, which I had received in the United States. And I was treated worse than a prisoner, actually like a prisoner, even though I had less rights than prisoners. I was put in a room where I could not open the window for 14 days. I didn't see sunlight for 14 days. I was not allowed to exercise for 1 second outside my room for 14 days. And before I actually flew back to Australia, I made an application that I wanted to quarantine at home. I put a plan. It was backed up by doctors that supported my petition, very reputable doctors in Sydney. It was dismissed in about an hour. And at the same time, I just found out that the Prime Minister, who was flying back from the same part of the world, also fully vaccinated with Pfizer, well, he went home. He was quarantining in the lodge at our expense, wasn't charged $3,000. And when I asked the question as to why, what's the difference? Well, I'm still waiting for a
James,
for a proper answer.
Well, one of the things I was curious to know about your decision to leave is how much of I guess you could say the health dictatorship that's developed in Australia is what caused you to go, and how much of it was the fact that so many Australians just seem to be completely on board with any sort of insane level of rulemaking that doesn't make any sense, that has very little basis in science, and that still sees people, millions of us, locked up in our homes, essentially under house arrest, and people say, oh yes, please keep locking us down, we just want to stay safe. How much of that attitude is what drove you to Florida?
That was actually the turning point. When I lived through the dictatorship, most people were against the military, where people wanted it to end. But here I found that people were on the side of the jailers. So I found it totally unpalatable. I just could not live in those circumstances. And I said to myself and to my family, I said, listen, this is it. I am not going to put up or live in a society who can accept these restrictions. One restriction that really drove me insane, basically, not literally, is the fact that I was not allowed to leave the country at will. That is a unique ban that Australia has put in place, and is absolutely incomprehensible to me. A, the need for the ban, and B, the fact that the Australians have accepted it and not revolted against it, because that is a sign of a brutal dictatorship. I don't know a single country anywhere in the world, comparable at least with Australia, that has put a ban of that nature indefinitely, permanently, until the Prime Minister sees fit to lift it. What sort of government would ever do that?
And finally, just before we go, Ezekiel, just wanted to ask you, you do know a lot about the Constitution from your legal work. I think the thing that most disturbed me is you believe that there is a complete lack of any legal protection under the Constitution, that the Australian Constitution is incredibly weak. Explain that briefly.
Well, I mean, the Constitution is there to protect people from government. But we have a constitution in Australia which is very ineffectual. It's a very weak document. It's never been copied by any other country, which contains no Bill of Rights, no basic rights that people, have to have and the government cannot trample on. So that means that the government can do anything, absolutely anything. If the government said tomorrow, or Parliament said tomorrow, that we all had to dye our hair red because that is good for COVID, they could pass that law and enforce it. Well, I'm sorry, but that is the case. There is absolutely no protection under the Constitution for Australians to enforce their rights, because we have none. All our rights derive from common law, and we always thought that the governments would exercise those rights judiciously. But this government didn't, and imposed, which I believe it is not a dictatorship because we have a democracy, because in the sense that we vote. But a democracy is not just the right to vote, it's the right to be able to exercise your rights. And if those rights are trampled on, sorry, it may be a democracy on the surface, but it's not really a democracy anymore.
Ezekiel Trumper, please enjoy Florida. I think many people will be nodding along and going, what did happen to the Australia we knew only 18 months ago? Thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. Speak to you again. Thanks.
I wonder. Thank you very much. All the best.
Okay, and coming up, it's pretty chilly there, but the woolly mammoth might be coming back. Good news on Ice Age Watch. Hello, you're watching Outsiders with James Morrow, Daisy Cousins and myself, Rowan Dean, and it's time for Outsiders, Weather and the Skeptics Ice Age Watch, where, well, wait for it, renowned weather expert and ballot harvesting aficionado Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. Sorry, Robinette? That's a pretty unusual middle name. Robinette? Robin what? Robin a bank? Robin a gas station? Robin I don't know, what else could a Democrat politician possibly want to rob or steal? Who knows? Anyway, I digress. Here's Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. eating an ice cream, which weirdly doesn't appear to be melting, even though Joe has promised us the world is heating up at a terrifying pace. So much so that the ice caps are all melting before our very eyes, but his ice cream still isn't. Still, we only have a few years left, apparently.
Because the necessity is there. We don't have a lot of time. We don't have much more than 10 years, for real.
Indeed, polar bears are now inbreeding because of climate change. First, remember, they were dying out because of climate change, but when that proved false, there are far more polar bears than there used to be. Now they're inbreeding and suffering from depression because of climate change. Of course they are. The United Nations agrees with Joe Robinette Biden, but they don't even give us 10 years. They say we're already out of time. But never fear. A new company which has received $15 million in initial funding was launched last week and has offered to save the planet and defeat climate change by bringing back the woolly mammoth. And they say it with a straight face. A wacko team of scientists and entrepreneurs announced on Monday that they have started a new company called Colossal to genetically resurrect the long-extinct woolly mammoth and then breed thousands of them on the Siberian tundra. This they intend to do by altering elephant DNA and splicing in genetic features such as dense woolly hair and extra fat. But the joke gets even better. The plan is to tackle climate change with the mammoth poos, known accurately as mammoth poo, which these climate change heroes believe can refertilize the Siberian tundra and return it to grasslands so as to keep the soil from melting and eroding and locking away heat-trapping carbon dioxide. What a genius plan! Perfectly sensible, obviously. But first, someone will have to harvest the eggs from a large female elephant in the wild. Rumours are the first couple of attempts didn't go too well.
Elephants eat up to 400.
But here's the thing. Perhaps these guys really are onto something, because what's the ideal climate for a woolly mammoth? Why, an ice age, of course. Indeed. Back in the 1960s and 70s, all the greenies and anti-capitalists and Malthusian lefties were busy predicting that an ice age was well on the way, thanks to the evils of capitalism and greenhouse gases, with headlines such as, "Scientists agree, world is colder," and "The ice age cometh," and "The world is getting cooler," which gave rise to the scary slogan, global cooling. But then when it looked like the world might actually be getting warmer in the late 70s, they quickly switched it to global warming, hoping nobody would notice the sleight of hand. After all, it was still all mankind's industrialization and those evil greenhouse gases which were to blame. But whoa! Then the damn weather changed again in the noughties when the warming appeared to slow down, so they switched it again, but sensibly kept their options open and called it climate change, which basically means whatever the weather is doing, hot or colder, wet or drier, windier, not windy enough, bushfires, drought, floods or hurricanes, you can still blame it all on human beings and their dreadful greenhouse gases. Quite the sleight of hand, just like that. Tommy Cooper would be impressed.
Pull it.
And now it's time for hyperbole, pronounced by Julia Gillard as hyperbole, meaning extreme or ridiculous exaggeration. I'm delighted to say for the first time, Therese Rain, the wife of former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, features James in hyperbole.
Yes, so this was fantastic. The other day, of course, it was sunny and people in Sydney were out enjoying the sunshine. So what does Therese Rain tweet? Why are they not being arrested? This was her tweeting, presumably from Noosa, where she and her husband Kevin have recently purchased a $17 million house at Noosa with 7 bedrooms, formerly owned by world #1 tennis champ Pat Rafter. But, you know, as we always say, we're all in this together. So if it's good enough for Therese and Kevin to be locked up and locked down in their $17 million Noosa abode, it's good enough for ordinary Sydneysiders to be locked up in their apartments too on a sunny day.
Well, I think Therese and Kevin should go one step further, James and Daisy, and invite struggling Sydneysiders, particularly from the western suburbs who can't get down to Bondi, and we don't want them to clutter up the beaches, do we? Invite them up to Queensland, to Noosa, to the Sunshine Coast, where they could camp out on the lawn with Kevin and Therese. What do you think, Daisy? Would that go down well? Likely to happen?
Look, I think that was a wonderful idea. It would be the only non-hypocritical thing for Theresa Rayne to do if she's just so concerned about people clogging the beaches, but I sadly don't think that's going to happen.
Now, Daisy, tell us about our two favourites. Speaking of hypocrites, I mean, there's no shortage here on the left of them, but these two doozies, Meghan and Harry.
Oh yes, well the latest is that Meghan Markle and Harry the Prodigal Prince have been named on Time Magazine's list of 100 most influential people. So that's a joke in itself, but if you look at the cover there, you'll see that Harry is crouching down in a sort of diminutive position, which was a deliberate choice to allegedly represent the equalness of their relationship. The problem is that it simply has the effect of making him look like Meghan Markle's hairdresser at the end of the appointment, checking on whether or not she likes her layers.
Fantastic. Let's go for some Weekly Wokeley. Now, I just find this so depressing. Learned this morning, Fraser Island is now being renamed K'gari or K'gari or whatever. What's this all about, Daisy?
Well, yes, it's another kind of wokey thing the Queensland state government has done. They've been collaborating with the traditional owners and they have decided to toss out the name Fraser Island and rename it K'gari, which means paradise in the traditional language. Now, well, that's nice. It's named paradise. What irritates me is that they're going to run around acting like they've defeated racism single-handedly with this one kind of wokey tokenistic thing. We know that's prolific on the left. It doesn't solve any of the very real problems that a lot of Indigenous communities have. It's just another kind of thing they can tick off the list while they ignore all the real issues at hand.
But hang on, I've got a problem here with this. I'm sorry, I'm just going to bring a bit of logic into this, James. And this is in no way to disrespect previous inhabitants of Fraser Island, but the term K'gari translates as paradise, really? I would have thought that the K'gari people only knew K'gari. I mean, it's not like they travelled the world and went, this place is horrible and this place is great. Paradise is a relative term. If all you know is Fraser Island, you can't call it paradise. It's just home. So I question that. Anyway, I may be completely wrong, but it's the linguist in me questions whether the K'gari people really did have a word for paradise. Anyway, James.
Oh, I was just going to say that, I was all for the name change until I realized that Fraser Island wasn't named for Malcolm Fraser and we weren't taking his name off of it. So there you go.
Now, James, just quickly tell us about this Facebook banning a song or something or other. What have they done now?
Yeah. So, Facebook, big tech, somebody has put up a really nice song, and we may have a little bit of it, but somebody has put up a song called Blood on His Hands, which is all about the botched withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan. And Facebook has, for whatever reason, banned this because, of course, we can't have any sort of, songs against the regime going out there on Facebook now, can we?
Well, maybe they can't on Facebook, but you certainly can here on Outsiders, and here's a little grab of Blood on Your Hands.
Got blood in my hands, flag of the Taliban, over Afghanistan.
Week's show. Thank you so much for watching us, and big round of applause for Daisy Cousins, who's done such a great job filling in for Rita. And get on to Twitter and tell her just that. We'll see you next week, Sunday, 9 a.m. Thanks so much for watching Outsiders. See ya.